The Gospel reading from Mark chapter 2 and 3. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.' Another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with a shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them, 'Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?' But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus." The Gospel of the Lord. Well, grace, mercy, and peace be yours in rich abundance today as we get to jump a little bit more deeply into this really interesting and kind of fun text from Mark chapter 2 and Mark chapter 3. And where we're going to get at the very end is, how are we supposed to view God's law today? Now that the law has worked in you and the gospel has worked on you, now you get to look back and think about, how do we use God's law? And where we're going to get at the very end of it is, one of the ways that God intends for us to use his law it's this law, love. In the Bible, there's really just two main teachings. You have the law of God, which is there to show you your sin and then point you to Jesus. The law is going to point you to the one who's going to save you. Then you have the gospel, the next main teaching in the Bible. That is the good news that Jesus died for you on the cross. These two teachings work together so that you see through the law how much you need the gospel. We're going to get there today, and to do that, I wanted to tell you a story that I read recently. It was about a gentleman who was doing a house project on a Sunday afternoon, and he was pretty eager to do it. So he got all the wood that he needed, and he got the saws out, and he was so eager that he made a little bit of a mistake. He forgot to put the safety goggles on. I don't know about you, but I make that mistake all the time. And so he was cutting the wood, and he got through all of the slices that he was making to the very last one, and there was this huge puff of sawdust that came, and it got in his eye, and some of it got stuck there. It was so bad that he couldn't get it out all day, and he was kind of rubbing his eye, and it was all pussed and swollen, and there were like tears dripping out. He considered not going to work the next day, but he toughed it out, and he did. He was sitting in his cubicle, and again, he's rubbing his eye, and there's tears coming down, and his friend next to him puts his arms over the divider and says, "What happened? Did you have a bad weekend? Did your girlfriend break up with you, or what's going on?" He said, "Oh, no, don't worry about it. I've got this little speck of sawdust in my eye. I just can't get it out." And his friend goes, "Okay, I think I can help you out. Let's go to the bathroom. I know how to fix this. I'm just going to flush your eye out." So the friend got a nice cup of water, and he walked into the bathroom, and it was kind of weird. He had his arms kind of like this, and he was kind of waddling in, and the original guy had his head back in the sink, and the second guy came, and he was going to flush it out, but he made a mistake. He dumped it, and it went right on the guy's head, and got it all over his hair. And the guy goes, "Oh, what's going on?" Try again. So he tries again. He's got another nice big glass of water, and it's weird. He's walking in this weird way, and he kind of like goes like this, and he dumps it again, and gets all over the guy's shirt. He misses the second time. What in the world's going on? All right, we'll try one more time. So he walks in, and he dumps it the third time. It goes right on the guy's cell phone and totally destroys the thing. Finally, that was the last straw, and so the gentleman opens up his eyes, and he looks at him, and he sees his friend, and his friend's wearing this weird apparatus. It's like this hat that's got this like 4x8 sheet of plywood strapped to it. And clearly that's why he's walking in and he can't really do anything. The guy opens up his eyes and he says, "What are you doing? Take the plank out of your eye, then you're going to be able to see clearly to get the speck of dust out of mine." You read that story before? You read it from a guy who knows a thing or two about carpentry because he grew up as the son of a carpenter. It's Jesus in Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus said, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Sometimes when Jesus is teaching, he's got a kind of a comical way of getting the point home. You know what he's teaching, though, right? If you've got a word of judgment against a brother or sister, you better really look at your own heart first. If you've got a word of judgment against a speck in somebody else's eye, you better take a look at God's law and see what it says about you before you keep looking at someone else. Now, this is Matthew 7, and I read from Mark chapter 2 and 3, so I'm kind of jumping around the Gospels here. What's going on? Well, what you're going to see today is this was the Pharisees' problem. They saw disciples walking through a grain field, picking grain, and they saw what they thought was a speck that needed to be removed. But what Jesus was going to show them is they had this massive plank that was clouding their vision so that it was impossible for them to use God's law in the right way. We want to try to get there so that when we move forward in our life, God's law continues to guide us. Now that it's worked on us to show us our sin, now that it's pointed us to Jesus and the gospel has clearly been proclaimed to Christians, how do we use God's law now? Well, as a guide for our life. We're going to look at that at the very end, but we got to get there by sorting out what's going on with Jesus and a grain field and disciples and some Pharisees. So let's get back to Mark chapter 2. One Sabbath. Now, a Sabbath was the Saturday of the week, and it was the worship day for the people of Jesus' day. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" So just to explain this a little bit, Jesus and his disciples, they're going through a grain field that's not theirs. It's somebody else's grain. And the disciples are picking some of that grain, and they're going to keep it, and they're going to eat it. The Pharisees see this, and they accuse those disciples of breaking God's law. You know, you could kind of summarize God's law with the Ten Commandments, so I'm going to remind you of what those are in a moment. And what do you think? What makes the most sense? The one command that it seems like those disciples are breaking. They're going through a grain field that's not theirs. They're taking somebody else's grain. So are they breaking the first commandment that says, "You shall have no other gods"? Are they breaking the second commandment that says, "You shouldn't misuse the name of the Lord your God"? Are they breaking the third commandment that says, "You should worship"? Or the fourth commandment that says you should honor your father and mother, or the fifth commandment that says you shouldn't murder, or the sixth commandment that says you shouldn't commit adultery, or the seventh commandment that says you shouldn't steal and maybe take somebody's grain, the eighth commandment that says you shouldn't speak false testimony, or the ninth and 10th commandments that say you shouldn't covet. On the face of it, it kind of looks like they're stealing, right? Walking through a grain field that's not theirs, taking some grain. The thing is, this is not what the Pharisees were accusing them of. The Pharisees knew their Bible. They knew a passage like this from the book of Deuteronomy that says, "If you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to their standing grain." See what God is getting at here? He's saying, well, you can't go harvest your friend's grain field and just take it all and put it into some bushels and sell it. But if you're a traveler and if you're hungry, your neighbor should be neighborly, and they should love you, and they should allow you to take a little bit of grain that you can have for sustenance on your way. God's law allowed for love. The Pharisees, they weren't accusing Jesus' disciples of breaking the seventh commandment, but instead they were focused on a different command, on the third commandment. That one goes a little bit like this. "Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, and this is the part that the Pharisees were focused in on. On it you shall not do any work. Well, God gave this command in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and the teachers of the law and the Pharisees over time and Jewish rabbis, they took this command and they said, okay, well, we don't even want to get close to breaking this command of God. How can we stay so far away that we make sure we are doing no work whatsoever? Over time, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they came up with 39 different ways that they thought it was possible for somebody to break the third commandment. 39 different ways that could be qualified as work. They called them the 39 melakot, or that's a Hebrew word that just means categories of work. Now, this isn't like a long-lost piece of the Bible or like a section of the minor prophets like Amos or Haggai or Habakkuk that are kind of fuzzy to you and, I better go home and read the melakot. No, the melakot is something that rabbis and teachers over time they came up with. They said, here are these categories that we say, not what God says, but we say is work that's prohibited on the Sabbath. I've got 8 of them for you. Here they are. For farming, you couldn't do any planting, you couldn't do any plowing, you couldn't do any reaping, you couldn't do any gathering. Those last 2, reaping or gathering, that's what they saw the disciples doing. So when those Pharisees asked the question, aren't they doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath? This is what they had in mind, the 39 melakot. If you were a baker, here's 4 things that you couldn't do on that Saturday. No kneading, no baking, no extinguishing of fire, no igniting a fire. Now, I was kind of imagining how this might have gone in Jesus' day. Imagine a man walking through the village, and he goes past a house, and he sees a fire burning. What would a Jewish man have to think? He'd have to say, hopefully my neighbor didn't start that on this Saturday, and hopefully they're not going to put it out on this Saturday, because if they do, they're a lawbreaker. What if another man walked past his neighbor's house and he saw a woman taking a loaf of bread out of the oven to feed her family? He'd have to say, look, she must have kneaded that and was baking that, and she's just feeding her family, but that's actually something that she shouldn't be doing. She must be doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath. Or what if Pharisees saw disciples walking through a grain field and they saw them picking some grain? They'd be left to say, according to those 39 melakot, they're doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath. Now my question is this really what God intended the law to be? Did God intend his law to be this list, this bar, this rule that we look through and say, hopefully everybody else is doing it, because if they're not, they're a lawbreaker? Is this really how God intended his people to use the law? To sit in their ivory tower and to say, okay, let's nitpick every little thing about it so that we can make sure that nobody else is breaking it. We saw the Pharisees doing that. But of course, we never do anything like that, right? We never put on those glasses that say, well, we keep it, but nobody else does, right? We never say, look at all of those people who are kind of sinful and lawbreakers. They should change their ways. That's never something we do, right? Well, we do it all the time. And in a little bit, we're going to dive more deeply into kind of how we do it and why that's clearly the wrong way to use God's law. But first, let's see what Jesus did for the Pharisees and how he taught them. Jesus said to them, Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Jesus recounts this Old Testament story where David and his soldiers were completely famished. They were on the brink of death. They went into the temple, and there was some bread there that God's law said needed to be consecrated and for the priests to eat only. But David and his soldiers, they went in, and David ate it, and he didn't just do it in secret. He gave it to his soldiers as well. They ate it, and you know what didn't happen? The ground didn't open up and swallow David and his soldiers. God didn't come to David and say, "Oh, because you've done this thing, I'm taking the kingship away from you." There was no consequence for this. God didn't condemn what David had done. Do you know what Jesus' point was? Jesus was trying to show the Pharisees that the law of love, when someone is in need, is going to supersede this written law. That kind of ended their conversation, but Jesus had another conversation with the Pharisees a little while later. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Jesus said, "Stand up in front of everyone." I love this. Jesus is no longer in a grain field, away from the worship area. He's no longer just with him and his disciples and the Pharisees. He's in the synagogue. People are watching. He sees an opportunity to test what he's taught the last time he talked to the Pharisees. He has this man stand up in front of everyone. Look how bold our Savior was. Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or evil, save life or kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Jesus saw that there was a need to love. And he was going to show those Pharisees that this was the law, that he needed to love his neighbor. Immediately, the Pharisees left there, and they went and held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Just a little background. The Herodians were friends with the Romans. The Pharisees were not. But the Romans had the power to crucify Jesus. So the Pharisees team up with the Herodians so that they can go to the Romans and have this plot to murder him. Now you've got to note the irony here. For the Pharisees, it was such a bad, horrible thing that Jesus' disciples were picking some grain. For the Pharisees, they couldn't even answer Jesus if it was right to heal a man with a shriveled hand on the Sabbath. But instead, do you see what they went and did? Look at that word, immediately. On the Sabbath day, they went and they plotted murder. Do you see the plank in front of their eyes? They were using God's law as a lens to look at others and to say, are they keeping God's law or not? God's law is just about all these boxes that we have to check off, and we're even going to add on a few more. And if you don't check it, you're a lawbreaker, but it's totally okay for us to go and plot murder, and on a Sabbath day nonetheless. Do you see how using God's law in the wrong way can blind a person to what God is really intending for it to do? But that would never happen to any of us, right? Maybe it's time for a couple of examples. Since we're thinking about the Sabbath day and this holy day, the third commandment, and how we use it today in worshiping the Lord, maybe you could think about your trip here to worship. Maybe you noticed something, that the roads were pretty empty. And you drove past a lot of houses where there were cars still in the driveway and the blinds were down, and you're pretty sure that those neighbors are just taking a nap. And I wonder if it's ever crossed your mind as you've driven to church to think, shouldn't they know the Sabbath day? They're dishonoring it. They should be in church. Then you get here to worship, and maybe you're one of those people that's dutifully here like 5 minutes before the bell rings. And you sit down and you're ready to worship, and then as the first hymn goes and as those first readings go, other people keep milling in for like 15 minutes, and you kind of look around and you think, don't these people know the third commandment? Shouldn't they be honoring the Sabbath day? Why can't they prioritize it? Or it's the middle of the sermon, and a child gets up and runs around and starts screaming his head off. And you start to think, can't those parents just teach those children how to honor the Sabbath day? I'm being so distracted. Or you've been here at St. Matthew's for a long time, and so you kind of know the membership list. And you look around and you see a lot of faces that are missing. And you think, Why? Where are these people? Don't they know the third commandment? They should be here. We often use God's law as a lens to look at other people too. There's an interesting thing that went on with the third commandment where at the very end of it we see what God was really trying to teach. It goes like this. He says, "Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor anybody else." And here's the key point: "so they may rest as you do." Sabbath is a Hebrew word that means rest. This command God gave to us so that we would rest in Him. If you're driving to church and you're judging the world for how sinful it is, are you going to be able to switch gears and rest in the Lord? If you're in worship and you're thinking about how other people should act differently, are you really going to be able to switch gears and rest in the Lord? The first proper use of God's law isn't to set up a mirror and put somebody else in front of it. It's to set up a mirror and to put yourself in front of it. Because when we really walk down the list of all of God's commands, well, what do we find? If you walk down the list, that first command, love God above all things, when you stand in front of that mirror, you see so many things that you've put in front of God. That second command that says don't misuse the name of the Lord your God, it's not just with things that you say, but it's also your reputation. That people could look at you and they'd see what you do and what you say and how you live, and they would see God's reputation. That's His name. You look down God's law and it shows you all of these ways to love other people too. To always respect mother and father. To never get angry. To never be lustful. To never steal. To never covet. You stand in front of that mirror and you know what the law does? The law kills you. The law buries you in a tomb. The law causes you to die. The law mounds on all of this guilt and all of the sadness of how we have fallen short. You know how that's a loving thing? Only a dead person can rise from the dead. Only someone who's been killed can come out of the tomb. Only somebody who's been piled on can that pile be removed. The law shows you your sin, and the next step is it's going to point you to Jesus. There was one man who could use the law as a rule or a guide to meet, and he met it. There was one man who loved God above all things, whose reputation gave God glory in His name every day. One man who remembered the Sabbath day every moment of every day. One man who honored his mother and father. One man who never got sinfully angry. One man who never lusted. One man who never stole. One man who never committed false testimony. One man who never coveted. And that man died. That man went to the tomb. So that when he died, he could take the shovel and put it on yours and move the dirt. So that he could rise from the dead, so that in your baptism, you know that that sinful nature inside of you has been drowned. That you know that you have a new flesh. That you know that you have a brand new life. As Christians, this is stuff that you know. The law comes to you and shows you your sin. The gospel comes to you and shows you your Savior. And now there's brand new life on the other side of it. And we get to look at God's law and use it in a totally different way. That's why Jesus said this. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Or if we can expand that to God's laws, God's law was made for man to help man out, not man to help out God's law. Or if I can put that even one other way, God's law finishes people. People don't finish God's law. If you've ever done a woodworking project, you know how long and arduous a process it is to finish the piece. You've got to go from the coarsest grit sandpaper all the way down to the finest after like 4 or 5 steps. But you start to see that finished product come through. Then you put some stain and you see the grain pop, and then you go clear coat after clear coat after clear coat after clear coat until it's finished. And then you get to look at it, and the thing gleams, and it's polished, and you're proud to have it in your home. After God's law has gone through the process of showing you your sin, after the gospel has gone through the process of showing you your Savior, now God's law can guide you in your life. Here's how. You get to look at how these laws of God show you to love Him. And you say, look at how Jesus loved me. Of course I'm going to love God with my whole heart. Of course I'm going to never misuse His name. Of course I'm going to worship Him. You get to see how Jesus loved every other person. And you get to say, look at what Jesus did for everyone else. Of course I'm going to love them too. At the end of the entire process, we see that God's law guides you and I. With this law, love God, love your neighbor. Amen.